take advantage of a great opportunity in Petaluma to get involved and help us play this radio consistently, you can join us on March 4th, 2018 at 5 p.m. It is our annual Envelope Please event, and you get to walk down the red carpet, sip on champagne, and watch the Oscars on the big screen at the Mystic Theater. So you can grab your tickets now for $4 pre-sale, and we are currently looking for sponsors and donations of all sizes if you'd like to get involved. And of course, you can reach us again at www.pca.tv, or the phone number is 707-773-3910. All right, so we're going to get into this topic. It's kind of going to cover a few things that I've already talked about. I'm going to move my chair. There we are. Now I can move. So it's going to kind of cover some topics that I've talked about in the past. I'm going to refer back to those a little bit in order to stay on point. And again, I'm going to be looking, if you haven't watched the show before, it is live in studio, and I am trying to make sure, because I don't have someone behind me helping me out, that I am able to answer your questions and whatnot if they do come through. So let us take a shot at this. So for those of us that live in California, usually I do shows that are national, but today I thought it was really important to touch on some issues that are directly affecting California in what I have called the policy war on California from the federal government. So I find this to be a really important topic, again, especially for California, but it does inevitably affect other states and can in the future. We've seen throughout this presidency that California has been targeted for various reasons. So I wanted to start out by giving some statistics about California. And basically, it's the sixth largest economy in the world, and it has the most business saturation nationally. So the other thing is the state is primarily liberal. We know that, but there are more conservative voters here. And it is 12% of the U.S. population. That's huge. That's a huge deal. And we'll kind of get into why I think that it's hard to understand why California is being targeted when it's the sixth largest economy and we make up 12% of the U.S. population. That should have a pretty big impact. And just for fun, the state flower is the golden poppy, just in case you didn't know. I think we all learned that in elementary school if you live in California. So I did a show, I've talked at several shows about the difference between state and federal rights. And part of the issue is that it had seen that we are working way more toward everything being shifted off to the states. We've seen that with the changes to the Affordable Care Act, or the proposed changes to the Affordable Care Act. We've seen that with the DACA rollback, which I'll get into more specifically in this show. And it's always suggested that the Republican platform is actually going to make the federal government smaller. So that would make sense with the pushing the decisions off on the state and the burden onto the states, but that hasn't happened, especially not for California. So I'm going to start. So I've chosen three major topics that are really affected currently by federal policy. And the first is immigration. We saw, and California has a large amount, a good saturation of immigrants. So I did an entire show on this, so I don't want to completely reiterate it, but I did want to talk about DACA again, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's also known as the DREAM Act. And if you are connected to the news in any way, you would know that it's still a hot topic. But what did happen already was that the DACA Act was put into place, and Texas filed a lawsuit with some constituents over the expansion of the DACA Act. And because of that, they originally dispute with the DACA and the DACA and the rights. So they sued the federal government, claiming that it goes against some of the laws and the president had power at the time in order to make those decisions. And so from that, they didn't come to a conclusion, so they decided to keep it within the address it during the next presidency. That was kind of the rationale. And once the expansion went through, because we suggested, I have the notes here, but there's a suggested expansion for the DACA program. And because of that, and the expansion to the DAPA program, which includes parents of immigrant children, with that expansion, the state of Texas threatened that they would sue over both bills, both proposals, in order to get rid of it, basically, in short. And because of that, there was rescission of both of those bills. So there hasn't been a plan suggested for the phase out or what that's going to look like. That's normal. We pass policy before we actually plan for the policy change. And so there hasn't really been much talk about it since it happened. And I think that that's a really important hitting point for California, because the presidency then, the administration then threatened funding over California being a sanctuary state. So that was basically saying that there was an authorization to, so police officers didn't have to cooperate with the Fed for immigrants who didn't commit one of 800 crimes. So if there were one committed in those 800 crimes, they could potentially cooperate. But that was what was one of the statutes under the sanctuary state. So, and most currently, there has been some significant threats about increasing deployment of federal agents within California. I have it written down as Cali, so I read it that way. And they're going to basically make it so that the local authorities can't refuse. And I actually was just reading about this today, so I had to add this on here. Where did I write it down? So there was an appointment of a new U.S. attorney. Why can't I find it? Okay, sorry, here it is. So we'll get into this in another section because it affects both of them, but there was the U.S. Attorney for Northern California has talked quite a bit about crackdown on a lot of these areas, and he's out of San Francisco. So that'll be interesting to see how that all comes through. And so that is the immigrants situation. Again, if you want to watch my entire show on DACA, it talks about Charlottesville, what occurred in Charlottesville and DACA. It's a few months old. You can find all those on my Facebook page. They're archived, and they were soon to be on my website. I promise. I've been saying that for a while. So let's move on to offshore drilling. This one, unless you're in the sustainability field or the environmental advocacy field, I think has been kind of shined over. And it's understandable because a lot of people don't focus on these issues in general. So it's kind of been passed over. And the offshore drilling that went, I believe it was within the tax bill. It was kind of just wedged in there, which they love, just sticking little things in the tax bill that don't really belong there. So basically, the offshore drilling category is a rollback of the Obama-era restrictions on offshore drilling. And it expands to both the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. And it's also suggesting to open the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico in order to do drilling. And you know that if you've ever gone through the Central Coast and you drove by Santa Barbara, somewhere in that area, you can see the old oil drills that are out there that have been non-functioning for quite some time. When I went to school in Santa Barbara, all the beaches, if you're at the beach long enough, you would get the dried up oil on your feet and all over your body. Let me tell you, it's really hard to get off. So you can see the environmental impact and why, in the media, and why they were regulated and they were stopped from pumping oil out. So it basically, this proposal opens up 90% of the nation's offshore reserves. It's basically everything is now going to be potentially going to be open to offshore drilling. And again, I'm not an expert in environmental issues, but I bet people can imagine what that impact is going to be over a period of time if all this oil is coming up, and it's going to obviously affect the ecosystems around where it's coming in, where the drills are going in. And also, if old ones are restarted, how that's going to impact the ocean. Don't we all love the ocean? So this is really an attack on the environment, but also what I think is really important to note that California is the birthplace of many of the renewable technologies and policies that were developed. Um, a lot of the green building policies and that have been adopted up into the national level, a lot of those happened in the city and county of San Francisco, and that's where they were piloted all over the state of California. So it's clear that it's not, I mean, it is an attack on the environment, but I also feel that, alongside the rest of the Pacific coast, that this is really a hit. Uh, and and if you didn't know about all the proposed cuts to EPA, it was actually frozen for quite some time. And the Department of Energy, they are trying to really, in my mind, defund those areas as if the environmental information we have is non-existent. I was on a call not too long ago for the National Small Business Administration Leadership Committee, and I'm on the technology subcommittee, and there was a lot of frantic companies on there that get most all their funding from the Department of Energy that were worried that they were going to lose it. And at that time, I haven't gotten a follow-up, but at that time, a lot of that funding had been frozen. And so these companies, mostly in sustainability, had no idea how they were going to continue. And I will never necessarily understand what is truly going on here, but I find it to be pretty devastating. And again, because California's been the birthplace and adoption of a lot of these things, I think it's a threat, and to the overall country, it's causing turmoil in small business. And we're not talking about a small amount of money that go to these companies. Just as a kind of side note, because I did talk about the highest level of business saturation being in California, they are also trying to get rid of some laws that ensured a certain amount of each contract went to small businesses. So again, I talked a lot in the last show at the tax reform that it was an assault to small businesses. And again, because there's such a large business saturation in California, it's almost not impossible to make some sort of parallel, because we will get hit pretty significantly. And now that people can't potentially write off their state taxes, that again, because it was going to most affect California and New York, because we have the highest tax rate, that's really going to hurt people, especially homeowners. So all those things being considered, there's definitely a legitimate attack on renewable technologies, on the environment. And again, I think this falls in the California category because they're trying to open up the Pacific Ocean as well to drilling. So another point that we know, luckily, was the delayed response to the fires. And there was a remarkable difference between the response to the hurricanes in Texas versus the fires both in Northern and Southern California. I didn't even check in to see if there was national coverage of Southern California, and I didn't even think the coverage in Northern California was as significant as the fires were. And so there was that, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, that was like a slap in the face. That was a direct slap in the face to California, saying that we don't care about you being on fire. I mean, those were some pretty impactful, significant fires that occurred both in Northern and Southern California. And there was really no comment for too much time. And that's just not a good thing to happen. We would want support from our national government if we're under, a huge natural disaster. So there was a huge delayed response to that. Luckily, we had our local and even further away states help tune in and help us out with both the Northern and Southern California fires, including firefighters that had to go right after from the Northern California fires to the Southern California fires. So shout out to you and all the rest of the emergency personnel that had to do with it. And I always have to give a shout out to the public health departments and the people that run those shelters, often overlooked, but they are also a really important part of making sure that people are taken care of and connected to the right services. I know that when I was working in one of the shelters, it was this frantic kind of setting it up, and I give them a lot of props in this, but there's all those little questions that you don't think about, like, well, what if we have a patient that has a medication that they lost in the fire? What are our protections if we go to the pharmacy? There's like all these little things that you don't think of. So just shout out to all those people. And I do want to point out that the offshore drilling period the offshore drilling law is still in public comment phase. This is so important for people that care about this issue. You have to respond. You have to call your representatives and make sure that you, and those that have the wherewithal, read the legislation. I think that probably one of the easiest methods is going to be to notify your representatives and make sure that they are pushing back on this. And I know there's a huge movement to also start getting support from other states because I think, we know where California stands. We know where Washington stands. We know where Oregon stands. So now we need our allies in other states. And so if we can get our representatives to help work with other states, and I know they already are, but making sure that we have that overall support. It's calling your friends in other states or messaging them on Facebook and say, hey, this is in the public comment period. Help us by contacting your representative and saying that you also do not support this offshore drilling. So let's get on to the topic that everyone was excited about, or not so excited about the outcome, but wanted to hear about it. So the third kind of major pillar, as I think, and again, you can get into specifics of different policies like tax reform and the certain pieces that affect California most. But I kind of pulled out the major pieces of this. So the third is cannabis. I think a lot of people in the area kind of understand that. I would hope if you live in California, you know that the recreational use of cannabis was put into law and was just started, I think as of January 2nd, someone correct me. But so you're able to recreationally use marijuana. I did want to give some facts. I got these from Politico about what the new law looks like and how it's going to be implemented. So of course you have to be 21 over to use recreational marijuana. It has to be from a state licensed facility. And then there also is county level control. And we've seen in Santa Rosa that they're kind of doing a lot with the zoning to see how that's going to fit. And then there are both state and local taxes. The state requires 15%, and then local taxes vary. I think they were saying the average is between 5 and 10% that also goes to the local government. So you can still get a DUI. That's another thing. If you drive around California, you see on all the billboards, they have all these little sayings, and now they have all these commercials about how driving stoned is still an impairment. I can't remember. There's one on the side of the freeway. But basically, you can still get a DUI. This is incredibly tricky because cannabis can potentially stay in your system for quite some time. And it's hard to test, and it's somewhat subjective if the officer is just doing field assessment of whether you are using cannabis or not. And so they're trying to figure out how that's actually going to look. I'm kind of shocked that there isn't a technology that can test how long it's been in your system with all the technology you have. But one of my other notes on here is that, in my opinion, that the pharmaceutical companies have inhibited research on cannabis projects. They don't have nearly as much research as other pharmaceuticals and other topics. So I think that's really been kind of attack in general on cannabis products because the pharma industry can't really get their handle on it. So the other fact about it is that a lot of people were asking if landlords can make it so you can't smoke on their property. If something says no smoking, it means no smoking. And there's really no way about that. I think that's pretty intuitive that, yes, a landlord can say you cannot smoke in their home or on their property. It's just like cigarettes. It's basically categorized as the same thing. And I know that I passed a non-smoking policy at one of my government campuses that I worked at, and it included smoking and vaping, and smoking anything and vaping anything. So those are some considerations for people that are renters, that it is very possible. And of course, this is intuitive, but you obviously still can't smoke within, I think it's 100 feet of a government building and a certain amount of area in front of buildings in general. So, and along with the big pharma and the general attack on cannabis use is it's classified as a Class A drug. So that's the most dangerous category. It's being compared to methamphetamines. And I just saw a meme today that was talking about how opioids are killing, thousands of people, and that's in the same category and is not being looked at as much as cannabis right now. That's really on the national stage when there's, of course, things that are killing way more people and other drugs that are killing way more people. I mean, methamphetamines, opioids, all those are huge issues in the country. Heroin. So again, I'm not condoning the use or renouncing the use of anything, but it's very clear that the fact that it was categorized in that arena is very interesting. And again, I think that this is a pharma thing. For sure. The pharma industry definitely has a lot of push on, and I talked about this on my last show with them reducing the public health and prevention funds, is because there's this push to keep people sick, because there's a lot of money in keeping people sick versus using prevention programs to keep them healthy. So I think that's another big thing here, is that they're trying to keep people sick, because if people are healthy, they're not going to buy their medications. So that's a huge thing, or their insurance companies aren't going to buy their medications. So the other kind of general concern, and I had this from producers, and this was also my concern, is that companies like Monsanto want to come in and create huge farm, just like they do with everything else, like they do with corn and like they do with all their produce, is they want to create these huge farms in order to, I mean, really, it's going to saturate the market, it's going to bring down the price, but then that really hurts small business because you're inhibiting the ability for not only competition, which is important in business, and actually the law to have competition, and a company can't monopolize the market. But more importantly, I think that, and this in itself is a really interesting impact on California, because I think it's like 75% of the produce in the nation comes from California. And so, companies like Monsanto coming in and producing marijuana, for example, not only will it saturate the market, it's going to impact our environment, because those much larger farms and production of anything, whether it's vegetables or fruits, really has a negative effect on the environment in long-term areas. And then the other thing is that it would be likely deduced that they're going to be using a large amount of pesticides. Again, everyone knows Aaron Brockovich, right? And that story. So that didn't have to do with pesticides, but it had to do with, what the Chevron was dropping into the water next to it. So there's a different kind of contaminant. But we see in the Central Valley that the farm workers have a much lower life expectancy and significantly more issues. So it's not just contaminated water, you have the pesticides, and then even if you are working on an organic farm, they've shown that the wind, and there's some gnarly winds that happen in the Central Valley, the winds will still pick up the pesticides. And if you're talking about a really large farm, they might be using some sort of airplane or flying apparatus to do that. And so obviously it's inevitably going to blow onto other farms. So I'm not sure that's a concern, but it should be a concern to, again, we've made huge strides in trying to impact what pesticides can be used and not. But at the end of the day, they're bad. And many of them are carcinogenic that even are still used today. So, and again, there's just been this huge kind of constraint with doing research on how this all fits together. That's one of my passions, is not only open collaboration between departments, but why aren't we studying this collectively and how it's impacting people, and what's going to be the impact on cannabis use if it is covered in a bunch of pesticides. What's that going to look like? So those are some of the issues that are happening. And what just currently happened was a proposed rollback of the Obama era. They love using that in the news. The Obama era, or basically during the last administration, probably be a better way to put it, that was passed saying, is a policy saying that the Fed was going to stay out of the state's laws and implementation for cannabis law enforcement. And again, with this new U.S. attorney for Northern California, I didn't write down his name. It wasn't even that important. But with this person being appointed, he has claimed that he's going to crack down on the cannabis in the Northern California region. And so, again, that's like a direct hit on California, because this person was appointed and to Northern California, where it's there's a large cannabis market and use. And again, I don't think that's real foreign to anyone that lives in this area. So, all that collectively kind of, and I think that those who watch my show know that I always come back to the media and how these things are impacted by the media. And I think that there has been this kind of pushback, like a significant amount of pushback, and really highlighting the negatives of cannabis use versus elevating any of the positives of the use. And so, again, this is, I think, really speaking to the federal government having it be illegal. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of hang-ups when cannabis use is legalized. We saw them in Colorado, for example, because there's, the FDIC banks don't want to collect money that's from cannabis use because it's federally illegal. So there are some issues that come about. I wrote on here, the government's allergic to planning. And like I said earlier, they love passing policies before they've actually thought about how to implement that policy. It's like their favorite thing to do. And it makes sense because they aren't necessarily the people. They get to stay way up here, and we've seen with a lot of the bills and stuff, they don't read them, but they get to stay way at the bird's eye view and make an assessment of what something should look on the ground without really talking to the people on the ground to assess what's going to work right. And we have a government where we have to go through our representatives, and I think that the problem that we're seeing right now is that those representatives are not supporting the best interest of the people that they're also actually supposed to be speaking for, and that's been systematic in the last few months. So I can only stress so much how important it is to vote people out from your area that aren't looking out for your best interests. And in the immediate, kind of making sure that you're involved in some way. And I know that sometimes it's a little bit here and a little bit there, but again, just making sure there's people in office that represent what you're looking for. But also, again, if you have people in other states that support this issue, even where it's not legalized, I think it's really important that we deploy and get their support, because again, people know where California stands. We're very open about it, and California has been the birthplace of a lot of stuff, not just sustainability, public health. The first, public health clinic, as we know, public health clinics today, was started in the Haight during, the big influx of people to that area. And you can still see the plaque on the wall. I had to go visit it because it's a big deal for me that's kind of where the original public health clinic landed, where people could get services for free in order to stay healthy when they were with a bunch of people in one place, because people were getting pretty sick during that time. So just bringing it back, a lot of these issues will eventually, and they're even saying with the law passed and with the state having to have a license through the state, having to have the proper applications through the county, and then, the increase in taxes will increase the cost. Now, again, it'll be interesting to see if these really large companies, if they come in and put in huge farms, if that will level out. Again, and for the smaller companies, it may increase costs because their overhead is increased costs, but we will have to see, one, if this actually holds up, and two, how it's going to plan itself out. And I know I mentioned with my DACA show that the state of California UC system is actually now suing the federal government for that rollback of that law. So again, it should be interesting to see how this works, because there's plenty of people that actually do want to follow the fact that this is a state right, not a federal right. And so this is where I kind of start to get into my parallels and analysis of this. Again, I said, the proposed changes to ACA were supposed to turf it off and say it's the state's job to deal with this. It's it's not a federal right, but it's so funny that they keep saying that. And then I talked about Charlottesville, what occurred in Charlottesville, and a lot of the history around the Civil War and before and after the Civil War. And that, again, the whole thing I talked about in that radio show was that the main point that, and this is actually put into history books, and I would almost guarantee it's still in history books because our education system's not great. It's one of the worst in this country. Or in the world, is that the biggest thing was that the Civil War to the Confederacy was about states' rights and not about oppression or slavery. Just let that sit for a second. So they actually developed this entire campaign and again put it in their history book saying that this was a state right. It wasn't about slavery. So again, that was a huge push. I think it's amazing, and I actually didn't know that when I was first starting to reach it. I didn't realize, because that was not in my history books, that the Confederacy was trying to say that the Civil War was about states' rights. I don't really understand that rationale. I guess it's because they didn't want to join the North and the South more cohesively. So I find that to be really interesting, but as I said before, the DACA decision was about states' rights. And it wasn't that it was about states' rights, it's that it showed how a state and its constituency can sue the federal government in order to get their way, for lack of a better term. And that, in my opinion, is a loophole of what states' rights looks like, because of that lawsuit, there was only so much that the other states could speak to within that lawsuit. And of course, they built this huge case against DACA and the expansion to DAPA, again, which includes the parents of children. And I don't want to get back into all the implications of that, but what I do want to say, that's overall, there's this overall inhibiting factor to what actually can potentially make the government money. And it's not that and again, my show is nonpartisan, so I try to keep it policy based, but I think that we're kind of on the same page about this nationally, because the approval rating of the current administration is so poor. But I think that this shift towards large government versus large companies versus small companies, and personal interests versus other interests. I think the DACA, let me see how many people are here. So DACA, it's 750,000 recipients in the entire United States. That is not that many people that are in the United States. And 91% are employed. And there's an estimated $433 billion loss in GDP over 10 years if the program really forced all of the dreamers out of the country. No one wants to look at that. They only want to look at the 750,000 recipients. Again, that's not a lot of people. And most people don't understand how this came to be. And I understand it's very convoluted, and it's very, again, it's convoluted. That's what the federal government wants. They want to make law convoluted so that normal people don't understand it. So that's part of my job here, is to help people understand it a little bit more tangibly. So again, the average age of recipients is 22, and 17% of those are pursuing advanced degrees. And like I said, 91% are employed. So these are people that are contributing to society. And like I said, there's an estimated $433 billion loss over 10 years. That is a significant hit. And again, I feel that the administration is working in their individual interests and not in what actually makes economic sense to the country. And that is a huge failure because it should be based on gains and losses. I mean, I thought that's how economics and a federal government should run. It should be looking at what the net gain and loss is if a program goes away or comes back. And, you know, they talk a lot about how much the program costs, but they don't talk a lot about how there's going to be such a large loss. And, you know, that's the same thing with the reduction in the public health and prevention fund, is that they're not looking at what the impact will be if all those services are lost. What they are looking at, though, is how much money will stay within the insurance companies and in big pharma, because again, if you're keeping people sick, if you're not providing them with prevention services, and I currently manage for one of my clients several grants that fall under that category, and so they're not looking, they're trying to claim that they're going to save money, but they're not looking on how much money over the long term would be saved if people were healthier. And this has been going on a long time, and I don't think that this is I don't think prevention is a crazy idea to people. We've known for, I want to say 15 to 20 years that providing prevention services has better overall impact, and people go to the doctor less, and they are sick less. And when people are sick, actually there is another hit to the GDP because they have lower productivity at work and they miss more days of work. And so there's a lot of contributing factors to this kind of overall attack on these various areas. And again, most every one of my shows so far, just because of the nature of my show being policy based and the nature of the current administration, has been on all the policies that are going away. I will add, though, while they're pulling money out of the public health prevention fund, they are going to create more community clinics. We need both of those things. We need prevention and more community clinics, especially in rural areas. And you can't really have one without the other. And again, I'm not going to get into my analysis of that. I think I bullet pointed it well enough. But people need services, and then they also need preventative services in order for them to be well. And just having a clinic somewhere doesn't mean that people are going to access services. But again, I won't get into that. I have some nice papers you can read from my public health program if you want to know more about that stuff. And even at that time, 8 years ago, I had to not fight with people, but I basically had to say that, you know, just having a facility doesn't mean that people are going to access services. Just to give I'm kind of on a tangent, but just for an example, I was doing most of my research in my grad school, besides my thesis, was on Mexican American women and their fertility rate and their overall health. And when I looked at the data, I think it was like Planned Parenthood data use, and Mexican American women access services pretty regularly. And I think by percentage it was pretty high, but they still have the highest fertility rate. So having access to services doesn't mean, in this case, they're actually going to do family planning. There was other impacts like cultural pressures and, you know, pressures from their husbands. But again, I won't get into all that, but there are other factors that contribute to this. And within prevention is education, why it's dangerous to have a high fertility rate, how you can get around that. And that's just one example of everything. You know, how do you prevent getting diabetes? How do you stop it if you're pre-diabetic? Like, those are all the things that the prevention fund, in my mind, are kind of pushing. So this is kind of where it doesn't make sense, because for the first year of this administration, they've been claiming that everything is about giving the power back to the states. Again, and that also puts the burden on the states. But now, all of a sudden, California doesn't have states' rights. That's what's happening, you know, from my point of view. And I'm not saying we're the only state that's experiencing this, but it's pretty elevated. And again, California is 12% of the entire population of the United States. That's a significant amount of people. And just because we live in a representative government doesn't mean that we should then be punished to not have that voice. And again, like I said, it has the highest business saturation. So those are prominent and important voices. I always joke, I was like, okay, we're just going to leave the federal government and we'll keep our Facebook and we'll keep our Google and we'll keep our Apple and go with us. So, I think it's a really interesting thing. And, this isn't the first time that a Republican or a conservative administration has tried to, kick California down. And I think the main reason is because California does have so much power in this country. They've impacted, we have impacted national policies like wearing helmets when you go on bike rides and putting your children. One of the biggest public health successes in modern time was, and more of a social programming, not just numbers and data, was implementing car seat use in cars. That's one of the huge public health successes. A lot of the smoking laws, and like I said before, a lot of the green building and sustainability technologies and laws originally came from California. And so I think that would be my guess of why there is such a pushback. I also think with the current administration, it's kind of like a tongue out, like, neener, neener, we're going to get you. And for those that don't follow the policy and follow the behaviors would know that. And so this is a huge issue. And it's not even necessarily, I have a lot of faith the state of California is going to come out on top on this one. But I think the overall perception of the country of California in certain areas is pretty bad. I was talking to someone that had, I don't know if his family in other states, I think it was acquaintances in other states, that people were basically saying during the fires, like, oh, let California burn. So there are many people in this country that have a very positive idea of California. There's many people that have a very negative idea of California. So I think that all this attention back on the state of California, framed as though we're doing all these crazy things, like we legalized cannabis and we're inhibiting the oil industry by not allowing drilling, and that wasn't just us, that was a federal thing. And then we're sucking up funds because we want to not send our immigrants out of the country, and we thought that the travel ban was illegal, like, all these little things. And luckily we do have a constituency, but I really think that those that do support actual states' rights and, not rolling back all these things and then not being an abuse of states' rights. I think that that's a really important thing, and more people need to be involved in, is to understand. Because I had said during my DACA show, these lawsuits are expensive, and that's our taxpayer money. And so if you're not concerned about that, you should be really concerned about that. So I think this brings me to my next point. Just like we say in research, whoever paid for it will get the outcome they want. That's why you always, whenever you're, if you are a data junkie or if you are involved in any sort of writing, then you should really look at who paid for the study. And that is really, really important, because, again, I think there's a study on, again, this is just an example, and they've done them on cannabis where it came out and it was like, yeah, it's going to totally screw you up and you're going to have like a shorter lifespan. But then you go and read, and I'm not saying I know one way or the other, but then you go down and read who wrote it, and it's like Pfizer. And that's just an example. I don't know that for sure that was the case, but those are the kind of things that you have to look at. And so that I bring that up because, and again, I don't think this is a foreign idea anymore in this country, but where the money flow goes dictates the decision. So again, you can see that the federal government wants to appease the oil industry. They want to appease the pharmaceutical companies, and they want to appease their followers that have been convinced that immigrants drain our society and drain our money in this country, which is not statistically true. And I don't have that data right here in front of me, but I know that's not statistically accurate, but they've been sold that for years, that that's the idea. And I won't make a South Park joke right now, but they do believe that the jobs are being taken away and that money's being taken away and they're using up all of our public services. And people that aren't citizens are, again, coming in and using all of our federal services, which is not true. I brought this up in my last show. It's not easy to get services, and unless you are under a certain category, like a prisoner of war or a prisoner of the sex trade, then you can't come in and get these services as a non-citizen. So it's a huge misconception. And I think that one of the issues that is hurting them right now is that if the state is taxing cannabis and it's federally illegal, the state gets to retain that money. And we know that the federal government wants to do anything they can to, and the IRS, to have their hands in our pockets. And again, that's not always bad. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes good programming comes out of it. Most of it goes to the Department of Defense. But so I think that's one of the major issues, is that the Fed in the back of their mind is saying, no, we don't want the state of California to get the money. We want to take it ourselves, or take a portion of ourselves. And so I think that's one of the driving forces. And then again, as I mentioned before, the implications of the tax bill, and what that's going to do to small companies. And I know that before the election, I don't like to say I told you so, but before the election I called it, because everyone said that Trump was pro-business, and I would constantly say that Trump is pro-big business. And the tax bill showed that C Corps, I don't want to get into business, but the pass-through agencies like S Corps and LLCs were hit, and then C Corps, which are generally larger companies because there's a lot of pieces in that, they got incentives. And again, we don't know exactly how that's going to work out because it's incredibly convoluted, and trying to figure out how the federal standards and the state standards are going to jive is making it very difficult for the people that have to implement it. Again, policy before planning. That is the U.S. government. So what do we do about it? I mean, what do we do, especially as Californians in a representative democracy where we have to go through our representatives and the whole country knows where we fall basically on these issues? What can we do? I think a big part of it is the state pushing back and ensuring that their decisions are upheld, and that the federal government can't come in all of a sudden and say that this is no longer a state right. I mean, they did roll back a policy that explicitly said that, but I do think the state of California now has the opportunity to say, wait, this is a state's right. This isn't a federal issue. It's federally illegal. Yes, we get that. It's federally illegal, but that's even more reason to leave it at the state level. And then again, the same thing with the federal raids with immigrants and sending them home is the same exact thing with cannabis. Like, I still think there's an opportunity for California to say, look, we're going to enforce it in the way that we see fit, like giving someone a DUI, but we are not going to allow you to come in and really, do raids and do all these crazy things that the federal government likes to do, which will never really address the issue. I mean, that's the failed war on drugs. That was one of the biggest, things that I was like, there's no way this is going to work, and it never has worked, and they still keep funding it. It blows my mind. None of that actually works to help people get off drugs. It doesn't help stop the drug trade. It doesn't help stop, the areas that are incredibly affected by this huge issue. And again, keep people out of services like mental health services or preventive services, and they're going to keep using. And then, we have these populations in certain areas are, they always say that your zip code, we in public health say that your zip code dictates your health very strongly. And so there's certain areas in this country that are in complete turmoil because of, drug use, alcohol use. And generally they're incredibly poor areas which get overlooked. So that's also a really important thing to look at. And as I said, I think that this is a movement away from, and we know there's a lot of, most of us know that there is a lot of individual interest in government. That's not how it's supposed to be, but it happens. I mean, even at the Supreme Court level, where it's supposed to be unbiased, we still see that there is this when the election occurred and they refused to appoint someone to the Supreme Court because they didn't want to go with Obama's nomination. Again, that was their way of manipulating the opinion of the Supreme Court, and that's not supposed to be biased. So it's, but you can see in a lot of areas, but I think we're even more significantly moving toward individuals' interests. So not even party interest, like individual people's interests, individual companies' interests, and that, there are a handful of people and companies around the world, around the country that this really benefits. We know the whole 1% thing of the super wealthy. And again, I don't want to get into that whole thing, but it seems that is the major interest, is that very small handful. And a lot of people can debate that that's always been the case, and I will not disagree that that was partially the case before, but now it's getting really significant. It's out there. And what's crazy about it to me is that the administration is so open about it. Before it was kind of a secret, and again, I don't agree with it being a secret, but now it's just, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to act, this is what I believe in, and somehow nothing's being done about it. So, and again, I don't have all the answers, but I feel like something needs to be done about this. So, as I said, you really need to contact everyone you can, your representatives, and get people caring about these issues. Again, I know in Northern California, there is a huge worry about the cannabis industry because that is a pretty large industry up here. But there's these other issues. There's the immigration issue, and there is the offshore drilling issue. And the reason that I did these together is because they may seem like very separate issues, but they're all being used to try to regulate California's decisions that they've made. And I think there's a lot more. I think that this is just a distraction method by, again, being so boisterous about it. They're going to keep doing other things, and they're going to keep trying to micromanage the large states with a lot of money and a lot of tax. That's good, a lot more taxes that go to the federal government and all that kind of stuff. And so we need to be on the watch for that. And again, I think that this is an opportunity for the state of California to push back and say, we're not going to do it. And I know that that's the plan, but without the general population behind that plan to say, no, this isn't happening, it won't work. So I think that, we're pretty siloed in a lot of the work we do, and a lot of my passion is bringing these different industries together because the health of the environment greatly impacts individual health. The health of companies and small companies greatly impacts individual health. Studying cannabis, there's a lot of studies out there that say that there's a lot of positive benefits. Being able to study that further in a more systematic way could potentially affect the physical health. And again, I have my own opinions. I don't want to go down that road. But, and then immigration. This is not only impacting the health of the immigrants, but you talk about the jobs and the contributions to the economy in California that they really do. That's a huge, population that really does provide tax money, sales tax money. And that's an important part of our economy. Not only is it an important part of our economy, it's an important part of our culture. That, why I love California is because it is so diverse. And I always say you can walk down the street and hear 5 different languages. And that's what I love about California. And I don't want that to be lost. And, it wasn't just the repeal of DACA and DAPA. It was the travel ban. It was all these kind of things where people literally couldn't get back in the country. And then who's next? What country is going to be next? That's a huge thing to consider because of the diversity in California. And there's other states that doesn't really affect as much because they aren't as diverse. And so this greatly impacts California, the Bay Area. This is a really highly diverse area, and we really do have a lot of economic contributions from immigrants, whether it's short-term or long-term. And I'm just concerned how these bans and these laws over the long term are going to start affecting other populations. Like, what happens if the federal government starts saying that we can't issue education green cards or issue, business visas and that kind of stuff, which a lot of people really depend on. So they are here legally, but what if the federal government says no more? No more visas, no more educational visas for this population, this population, this population. No more business visas. And a lot of employees get those business visas in order to work in this country. And that's a big deal. We're losing huge contributors to our, not like I said, not only our culture but our economy, and it's really inhibiting the voice and the voice that is created when we have a diverse community. So I put a note here. This is another thing I saw today, that Trump said that the immigration bill should be a bill of love. I'm just gonna leave that right there. I don't know how you can create a policy around love, but if anyone figures it out, you let me know. So I'm going to wrap up here because I'm just about out of time. Again, if anyone has questions after the fact, please, I will try to find an answer for you, or I will find someone that has an answer for you. And so thank you for joining me. Again, this is DG the 30-something State of the Union, and you are listening to KPCA LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM, also online at kpca.fm. And our email to reach us is kpca@pca.tv, P.O. Box 2806, Petaluma, California, 94953. Thanks, everyone.